Every year, photos circulate after a major typhoon of solar panels twisted off rooftops, glass shattered, aluminum frames bent flat against a fence 3 houses down. It looks like bad luck. It's almost never bad luck. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases, it's a mounting system that was never actually rated for the wind it was hit with, installed by someone who assumed solar panel meant built to handle weather without checking what weather, specifically, it was tested against. Japan, sitting directly in the path of some of the most intense typhoons on Earth, developed a real engineering answer to that problem decades ago. And today, we're building a small-scale version of it for around $260. Before we continue, let me mention one thing. Many of the Japanese methods I share in these videos have been collected into a practical guide over at the Japanese Home Manual. If you'd like to explore them in more detail, you'll find it there. That's all. Now, let's get back to today's method. Let's start with the actual engineering standard behind today's build. Because typhoon resistant is a phrase that gets thrown around constantly in solar marketing without ever being tied to a real number. Japan's solar mounting industry works from a structural design code called JIS C8955, the country's official standard for calculating wind load on solar support structures, how hard the wind pushes down on a panel, and just as importantly, how hard it pulls up on one, since a panel catching wind from underneath behaves like an airplane wing trying to lift off the roof. The baseline test most solar mounting hardware is certified against, under the related international standard IEC 61215, is a static load of 2,400 pascals, roughly equivalent to sustained wind speeds in the range of 130 to 140 kilometers an hour. Higher-grade mounting systems, built specifically for the most exposed, typhoon-prone coastal regions, are tested and rated up to 5,400 pascals, covering wind speeds well beyond 200 kilometers an hour. That range matters because typhoons themselves aren't one uniform threat. Japan's own meteorological agency classifies them by intensity, from strong through very strong up to violent, with wind speeds climbing from roughly 120 kilometers an hour at the lower end past 190 at the extreme end. A mounting system built to the standard 2,400 pascal baseline genuinely covers a strong to very strong typhoon. It was never going to hold against the most violent storms in that classification. And no honest description of any residential-grade solar mounting system, however well built, claims otherwise. That's the first piece of honesty this video is built around. We're not claiming today's build survives literally anything nature can produce. We're building it to a real, specific, verifiable standard, and being upfront about exactly where that standard's limits sit. Here's the second piece of honesty, and it's arguably the more important one, because it's the actual practice that protects the most solar equipment in Japan every single typhoon season. And it has nothing to do with how strong your mounting hardware is. For small residential and portable solar setups specifically, the scale we're building today, not a professionally engineered rooftop array. The standard advice from Japanese solar installers and disaster preparedness guidance alike, once a genuinely severe typhoon warning is issued, is simple. Take the panel down, not reinforce it further in place. Remove it entirely, store it flat and secure it indoors or in a sheltered space, and reinstall it once the storm has passed. A panel that isn't mounted at all during a violent typhoon can't be torn off a roof or turned into a projectile. And for a small-scale system built on a budget rather than professionally engineered and permitted, that's a genuinely more reliable strategy than trusting any DIY mount to hold against the most extreme wind speeds Japan sees. This is, in a real sense, the same underlying instinct behind the Bosai bag and the water tank we've covered on this channel before. Not building something invincible, but building something correctly scoped, with a clear, practiced plan for the specific scenario that exceeds it. That's why today's build is designed around two things working together, not one heroic piece of hardware. A mounting system genuinely built and rated to the real 2,400 Pascal baseline standard, sturdy enough to stay put through the overwhelming majority of storms it'll ever actually face. And a quick-release design specifically so it can come down in minutes, not hours, on the rare occasion a genuinely violent typhoon is inbound. That combination, solid for the common case, removable for the extreme one, is the actual 30-year method in today's title. And it's worth explaining exactly what that phrase means before we get into parts and pricing. Because it's not a promise that the panel sits in one spot untouched for 3 decades. The 30-year figure comes from the panel itself, not the mount. Monocrystalline solar panels from reputable manufacturers commonly carry 25 to 30-year power output warranties, guaranteeing the panel still produces a meaningful majority of its original rated output, typically 80 to 85%, after that full span, with the panel degrading gradually at a rate of roughly 0.5% per year rather than failing outright. That's a genuine, verifiable industry standard, not a marketing exaggeration specific to this build. A panel that's properly mounted most of the time, taken down for the handful of genuinely extreme storms it faces over 3 decades, and otherwise left to do its job, can realistically reach that full warranted lifespan, not because the mount alone protects it indefinitely, but because the combination of solid everyday mounting and smart removal during the rare true emergency avoids the single most common way a panel's life actually gets cut short, getting torn off its mount and destroyed in one storm nobody planned for. Over the rest of this video, we're going to build the actual system, the parts, the real cost breakdown, exactly how to mount it to genuinely meet that 2,400 Pascal baseline on a DIY budget, and the specific quick-release detail that lets you take the whole thing down safely in under 10 minutes when a real typhoon warning comes through. It's worth being clear about who this build is actually for, since typhoon-resistant language can easily be misread as a claim for anyone anywhere. This is built specifically for a small standalone panel, the kind used for a shed, a workshop, a backup power setup, or a portable off-grid system, not a large, permanently installed rooftop array feeding your entire home. A full residential rooftop solar installation is a genuinely different project, requiring a licensed installer, a real site-specific wind load calculation, and permitting, precisely because the stakes and the structural complexity are much higher. What we're building today is deliberately smaller in scope, a single panel mounted securely enough to handle real, common storm conditions, and designed to come down easily for the rare occasions it can't. That distinction also explains why this build genuinely can hit a real 2,400 Pascal equivalent rating on a budget of around $260, where a full rooftop system rated to that same standard, professionally installed, would cost dramatically more. A small, low-mounted, single-panel system has far less surface area for wind to act on, sits closer to the ground where wind speeds are typically lower than at roof height, and can use simpler, more robust anchoring than a large array spread across an entire roof. None of that makes today's build a toy version of real wind engineering. It means the physics genuinely work in favor of a small system being achievable at this price point. In a way, a large rooftop array simply isn't. Let's build it. The build has 6 components, and the mounting hardware gets just as much attention here as the electrical parts, since a perfectly good panel on a weak mount is the single most common failure mode we're trying to avoid. First, the panel. A 100-watt monocrystalline panel, typically running $85 to $105. Monocrystalline is worth the modest premium for the same reason we've covered on other builds. Better performance in partial or angled light. But it also matters here for a structural reason. Monocrystalline panels are generally somewhat more rigid than cheaper polycrystalline alternatives, which matters when the panel itself needs to resist flexing under wind load rather than just producing power efficiently. Second, the charge controller, a basic PWM unit running $15 to $20, doing the same job it does in every build on this channel, protecting the battery from overcharging, sitting between the panel and the storage. Third, a 12-volt, 20 to 30 amp-hour lithium iron phosphate battery, running $75 to $100 depending on capacity, providing storage for whatever DC load you're running off this system. The same live FePO4 recommendation as every other build on this channel, chosen for its durability under repeated cycling and its stability compared to cheaper lead-acid alternatives. Fourth, and this is where today's build genuinely differs from a standard solar project, the mounting frame itself, built from galvanized steel angle iron rather than the lightweight aluminum brackets sold in most basic solar mounting kits. A meter or so of 2-inch galvanized angle iron, along with the bolts and brackets to assemble a simple A-frame or tilted ground mount, runs $35 to $45 at any hardware store. Galvanized steel is heavier and stiffer than the thin aluminum extrusion used in most budget mounting kits, and that added rigidity is exactly what a real wind load rating depends on. A mount that flexes under load is a mount that eventually fails at its weakest connection point, usually well before its individual components would suggest it should. Fifth, the anchoring system, which is what actually ties the frame to the ground rather than letting wind treat the whole assembly as a single object to lift. For a ground-mounted setup, this means concrete deck block anchors or ground screws at each corner of the frame, running $20 to $30 total for a small single-panel mount, providing genuine resistance against both the downward push and the upward pull wind generates on a tilted surface. This is the step most DIY solar mounting content skips entirely, simply bolting a frame together and setting it on the ground or a rooftop without any real anchoring, which is precisely the setup that ends up in those post-Typhoon photos. Sixth, and this is the detail that makes the whole 30-year method honest rather than aspirational, quick-release wing nut fasteners at the panel's connection points to the frame rather than fully torqued permanent bolts. This adds only a few dollars over standard hardware, but it's what turns "take the panel down before a violent typhoon" from a theoretical piece of advice into something you can actually do in under 10 minutes without needing a full toolkit and 20 minutes of wrenching in worsening weather. Loosen 4 wing nuts, lift the panel free, carry it indoors, and the bare frame, low profile, empty, and genuinely less likely to catch significant wind on its own, stays anchored in place. Add it up. A 100-watt panel around $95, a PWM controller around $18, a 25 amp-hour Life PO4 battery around $90, galvanized angle iron framing around $40, ground anchoring around $25, and wing nut quick-release hardware plus basic wiring and fuses around $15. That lands right around $283 as priced, slightly above the $260 headline figure once every safety-relevant component is accounted for honestly. Though shopping sales on the panel or battery, which are the 2 largest line items, comfortably brings a careful build back down to the $260 range without cutting into the mounting or anchoring hardware, which is exactly the part of this build you don't want to economize on. Now for the assembly itself, and the specific detail that actually gets you close to that real 2400 Pascal baseline rather than just a mount that looks sturdy. Keep the panel's height low, mounted close to the ground rather than elevated on a tall pole or a roof edge, since wind speed increases meaningfully with height, and a panel sitting at ground level, especially with some natural windbreak nearby, faces genuinely lower wind loads than the same panel would at rooftop height. Angle the frame's tilt to roughly match your latitude for good year-round sun exposure, But be aware that a steeper tilt angle also increases the wind-catching surface area facing the prevailing wind direction. So where possible, orient the panel's tilt away from your region's typical storm wind direction, rather than purely optimizing for sun angle alone. Use 4 anchor points rather than 2, 1 at each corner of the frame rather than just 2 along a single edge, since a 2-point anchor lets the frame rock and twist under alternating wind pressure in exactly the way that eventually works bolts loose. Torque every bolted connection to the hardware manufacturer's specification rather than tight by feel, since under-torqued connections are consistently the actual failure point in real-world wind damage post-mortems, more often than the frame material itself failing. And route your wiring with enough slack and secure clipping that it isn't pulled taut or flapping loose in wind, since a wire whipping in a storm is both a wear point on the wiring itself and, over enough cycles, a stress point on wherever it connects to the panel or controller. In the final part, we'll cover the actual quick-release removal routine, when to trigger it based on real storm classification rather than guesswork, and the honest math on what 30 years of properly maintained panel life actually looks like. Let's cover exactly when to actually use the quick-release feature, because take it down before a big storm isn't useful advice without a real trigger point, rather than a vague sense of when a storm feels dangerous enough. Japan's meteorological agency classifies typhoons by sustained wind speed into a small number of clear categories, and it's worth tying your own decision to that same kind of concrete threshold rather than instinct. A storm classified as strong is broadly within the range this build's mounting is genuinely designed to handle, assuming the assembly instructions from Part 2 were followed correctly. Once a storm is upgraded to very strong, and especially once it reaches the violent classification, that's the point to treat as your trigger to remove the panel entirely, well ahead of the storm's actual arrival, not the night before, when wind may already be picking up and working outdoors becomes genuinely hazardous in its own right. If you're outside Japan, most national weather services publish an equivalent categorization, hurricane categories in the US, for instance, and the same principle applies. Pick the threshold in your local system that roughly corresponds to sustained winds above 140 to 150 kilometers an hour, and treat crossing that threshold as your firm cue to remove the panel, not a moment later. The actual removal routine, once you've built the quick-release wing nut connections from Part 2, takes under 10 minutes for a single small panel. Loosen the 4 wing nuts at the panel's corners, lift the panel free of the frame, and carry it to secured, sheltered storage, a garage, a shed, or simply indoors laid flat against an interior wall. Disconnect the panel from the controller at the connector before carrying it, rather than dragging cable along with it, and cap or tape over the exposed connector ends to keep moisture and debris out while it's stored. The empty frame, low profile and anchored at all 4 corners, stays in place. Without the panel's surface area to catch wind, the bare frame presents dramatically less resistance and is far less likely to be the thing that fails, even in a storm well beyond the mount's rated capacity. Reinstalling afterward is just the reverse. Confirm the frame and its anchors weren't disturbed or loosened during the storm. Reconnect the panel to the controller, set the panel back onto the frame, and retighten the 4 wing nuts to spec. Keep a simple written log of each removal and reinstallation, even just a couple of lines in a notebook by the door. Date, storm name if it has one, anything you noticed on reinstall. Since over several years that log becomes a genuinely useful record of how often you're actually taking the panel down, and whether your chosen threshold from earlier in this section is calling for removal too often, too rarely, or about right for where you actually live. It's worth doing a quick visual check of the wiring and connections every time you reinstall, simply because it's an easy, low-effort moment to catch a developing problem. A slightly frayed wire, a loosening anchor bolt, before it becomes a real failure during the next storm. Now, the honest math on what 30 years of panel life actually looks like, since that number deserves the same scrutiny as every other figure in this video. A monocrystalline panel degrading at the commonly cited rate of roughly 0.5% per year will, after 30 years, still be producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of its original rated output. A real, gradual decline, not a cliff, and one most manufacturers' own performance warranties are built directly around. That degradation has nothing to do with the mounting system. It's simply the slow, expected aging of the photovoltaic material itself, and it happens at roughly that same rate whether the panel sits on a museum-quality mount or a budget one, as long as the panel itself was never physically damaged. What actually threatens that 30-year lifespan, in the overwhelming majority of real cases, isn't gradual degradation at all. It's a single catastrophic event. A storm tearing the panel loose, shattering the glass, bending the frame beyond repair. That's precisely why today's build spends real money and real attention on the mounting and anchoring system, rather than treating it as an afterthought behind the panel and battery. A 25 to 30-year warranted panel that gets destroyed in year 4 during one storm nobody planned for never comes close to its rated lifespan, no matter how good the panel itself was. The same panel, properly mounted for ordinary weather and taken down for the rare genuine emergency, has a real, honest shot at actually reaching the number printed on its warranty card. That's the complete, honest version of today's build. A panel and battery system priced around $260 to $280 depending on how carefully you shop, mounted to a real, verifiable wind standard rather than a vague marketing promise, with a genuine, fast way to remove it entirely for the handful of storms each decade that exceed what any small DIY mount should be trusted to survive in place. Not a claim that this setup laughs off a Typhoon parked directly overhead, a claim that it's built correctly for the storms it's actually rated for, and smart enough, by design, to get out of the way of the ones it isn't. Before you go, tell me in the comments what the strongest storm your area has ever seen actually measured, and whether a removable mounting approach like this changes how you'd think about installing something similar yourself. If you've already got a solar setup that's been through a real storm, share how it held up. I read every comment, and those real, lived accounts are usually exactly what shapes the next build on this channel. One last honest thought before you go shopping for angle iron and wing nuts. It's tempting, once you understand the real engineering behind wind load ratings, to want to over-engineer this build past what it actually needs. Thicker steel than necessary, more anchor points than the frame calls for, a mounting system rated for pressures your region has never once seen, and likely never will. There's nothing wrong with building in a genuine safety margin, and the numbers in Part 2 already include one, but chasing the absolute maximum rating available isn't really the point of this build. The point is matching the mount to the real, documented wind history of your own specific location, with a fast, genuine way to remove the panel entirely for the rare outlier event that exceeds it. Not building something so overbuilt it never needs the quick release feature at all, at a cost that stops making sense for a single small panel. If you're not sure what wind speeds your own area has actually seen historically, that's worth 10 minutes of research before you finalize this build, rather than assuming. Most national weather services publish historical storm data by region, and knowing your area's actual worst-case wind speed, rather than a generic, just build it as strong as possible, is what turns this from a guess into a genuinely engineered decision, the same way every build on this channel is supposed to work.